Good morning. We are in the middle of chapter 7. Chapter 7 discusses the science of elevating mundane things to holiness, or the opposite, casting mundane things down into the grips of impurity. How do we do that? So previously we explained that everything in the world has its body and its life force that sustains it. The life force of every object, of every existence, comes from a certain spiritual level. Some things are sustained by absolute holiness, godliness. Some things are sustained by absolute impurity, and some things are sustained by impurity that is pliable enough to be transformed to holiness, or even to allow holiness to shine through it, and or of course to be cast down into absolute unholiness. The rule of thumb is this: when a person encounters a physical object that is permitted for them to use, it's permissible. Either the food is kosher, so you're allowed to eat it, or the activity is permitted according to Torah and you're allowed to do it, but it's not a mitzvah. We have to realize that that activity and that object will have a force of life inside of it. And depending on what we do and how we use that object and that activity, we can transform the very life of that object and that activity. We can take a mundane object and infuse it with holy life, literally changing the nature of the object from something mundane to something holy. For example, you can take the skin, the hide of a cow, and literally with your own hands turn it into a sacred object of the Torah scroll or the tefillin box, where you've changed the very nature of that creature. It's no longer a mundane animal. Now it is absolutely sacred, that if it falls on the floor, you'd have to fast or give tzedakah. If by our hands, that's an overt overt example of how a human being can transform the very essential life of a physical object. There are more subtle ways. For example, let's say you have you own an object that people like to borrow. You own an object that people like to borrow. For example, what might be an example? You have a lawnmower tractor. People love to borrow your lawnmower tractor. Your what do they call it? The riding mower. Yeah, people like to borrow it. So, are they allowed to borrow it? The life force of your riding mower is powerful. It's not holy and it's not unholy. It's not forbid for your neighbor to use it. If he will ask your permission, that's a holy activity. If he will steal it from you, use it without your permission, now the energy, the life force of that activity is evil. What about the life force of the mower itself? Nothing happened. The mower is just a mower. But what if you say, you declare as a vow or as an oath that is valid according to Torah, no human being that's not related to me shall ever be allowed to benefit from my riding mower. All of a sudden, according to Torah, that mower becomes treif for anybody that's not related to you. It becomes a forbidden object. You've changed the very nature of the relationship of the people and the mower. Okay, and that's really what we're going to talk about in this section. There is a more serious transformation that's possible, where not only are you going to transform the energy that lives within the object, but you can actually permanently convert a physical, mundane object into something that will be permanently unholy, but we'll do that in Mitzvah Hashem another time. For today, we're talking about things that are permissible, and we're focusing on the life force that's inside of them. Some examples. Kegoin derech mashal. By way of analogy, the Alter Rebbe is going to give us some examples about how you use mundane things in a manner that will either elevate them to holiness or cast them down into unholiness. Kegoin derech mashal, by way of analogy, ha'echel bisra shmeina, a person who eats fatty meats, the tura of an ox, v'shoyse yayin mevusam, or he drinks perfumed wine, scented, spiced wines. Why should that be allowed? To expand, to broaden his mind for Hashem, for the sake of Hashem, and for the sake of the Torah. And this has been expressed in the Gemara, and the Alter Rebbe makes a brief reference to it by saying, Kid Amar Rava, as Rava says, Chamera v'reicha, wine and fragrance, etc. What's the etc.? So let's take a look at the sources. Here we go. There are a few sources in the Gemara that describe where you have the Tanoim, the sages of the Gemara or the sages of the Mishnah, describing the usage of meat and fragrance or other delightful things, pleasurable things, for the sake of Torah learning or for the sake of holiness. Here's an example. Rav Kahana Rami. Rav Kahana asks a question in the form of a contradiction. Ksiv, it says in one pasuk, Tirosh, V'koreinan Tirosh. It's written as Tirosh in one pasuk, but we read it as Tirosh in the same pasuk. Tirash sounds like an activity, and Tirosh sounds like a noun. So how are we supposed to understand that? Says he explains, Zacha, it means that if a person is meritorious, Nasa Rosh, he will become Rosh, into a leader. Lo Zacha. I'm sorry, if he is meritorious, if he's worthy, then he will become Rosh, a head. If he's not meritorious, if he doesn't merit Nasa Rosh, he will become a pauper, he will become the lowliest. And that is similar to what it says, V'hainu de Rava Rame. This is similar to what Rava says, because Rava also brings a contradiction in a pasuk and how you read it and how it's spelled. In one pasuk it says Yisamach, and the vowels are Iksiv Yishamach. It says with a shin, it's written Yishamach, but we read it as though it has a sin, Yisamach. What does it mean? It means like this: if you are meritorious, Zocha Misamche. If you're meritorious, then it will cause you to be glad and happy, from the word Simcha. If you are not meritorious, then not only will it not make you happy, it will confound you, it will cast you into chaos, shomim, gloom, and so on. And that's talking about food and drink. That's what Rava taught. Chamera v'reichane pakchun. Rava says, wine and good sense have made me wise, because he used them in such a way that he was meritorious and they were able to improve his ability to learn Torah. That is what the Alter Rebbe is referring to by saying Chamera v'reicha, etc. There is value to eating and drinking in that it can improve your ability to serve Hashem properly. some more examples from other places in the Gemara. In Baba Kama, it says that there was a discussion between Rava and Rab Nachman, and Rab Nachman argued something, and the next morning he came back and he says, you know what, I changed my mind. What I told you last night was incorrect. I have a different opinion this morning. And then he explained why he changed his mind. Letzafra, in the morning, Omar le Rav Nachman says to Rava, the reason I didn't tell you this explanation in the evening last night is the lo achle bisra de Tura, is because I had not eaten the meat of an ox. And because I hadn't eaten the meat of an ox, my mind wasn't working properly, and I was not able to sort out the facts as I should have. So again, you see that there's utility in eating even the most delightful things, and especially the most delightful things, to help your mind work properly in the service of Hashem. There is a bit of a debate between Rashi and Tosfos, which I bring just for your entertainment. Tosfos says that he means it literally. He was fasting at the time, and therefore he hadn't fed himself properly, so his brain wasn't working. It's as simple as that. And Rashi says he was speaking in euphemisms, that it doesn't literally mean that he hadn't eaten meat. It means that when you eat the meat of an ox, you have to chew it over very, very well. And in this case, he hadn't chewed it over properly. But over the nighttime, he had a chance to review his argument, and he realized that that's not the truth, and he changed his argument. Either way, if we're just reading the words of the Gemara and we're following the translation of Tosfos, we see Tosfos allows for this utility. You eat meat so that you can study better. The consumption of this permissible food, it's kosher food, you're allowed to eat it, but you ate it for the purpose of serving Hashem, not just that it is. What is this the opposite of? This is as opposed to eating kosher food simply because it's yummy and your tongue wants to enjoy the flavor and your tummy wants to enjoy the warm feeling of having eaten something. You eat it for the purpose of serving Hashem, like we learned in the Shulchan Aruch last time we met. You eat it for the purpose of serving Hashem. By eating the meat, you're able to serve better.
Rabbi?
Yes.
If, like, I know that when somebody, if somebody has health problems and it's like a fast day, you're not supposed to fast if your doctor thinks it could be a serious risk to your health. And I've heard that in that case, it's like a kuach nefesh. In regular life, if somebody needs to eat to preserve life, like I'm assuming all of us need to some extent, does that, if we're eating so that we're alive and so that we can serve Hashem, does that count, or is that not in the same vein?
So there's a very fascinating, very delicate difference between what we're describing here and what you're describing. Both are kosher. The question is just what is the process? What is the spiritual process of that kosher food when you ate it? Does it go down first and then come back up when you used it for the mitzvah? Does it go when you're actually eating it? Does it go directly to the realm of holiness? That would be the distinction. If a person is eating and he has no intention of deriving physical pleasure from the food, although the body does delight in the food, that can't be helped. Delicious food is delicious. Unless you're on a super high level, like, for example, there's a story of the Baharin Karliner, a big tzaddik in the 1700s and 1800s, visited the Alter Rebbe. They spent a Shabbos together. And everybody wanted to participate in preparing that meal that those two tzaddikim would share together. And so, the chefs were in charge. You're not allowed to mess with you're not allowed to do a major activity in the kitchen without permission, but everybody snuck into the kitchen. And they, one after another, apparently they assumed that if they just add a small pinch of salt to the Shabbos chicken soup, nobody would notice, but this way they would have the merit of participating in preparing a meal for these two giants, for these two tzaddikim. At the end of the end was that by the time the soup was served, it was so salty that you couldn't swallow it. And the Alter Rebbe saw that his honored guest is not eating the soup. And so he thought maybe the soup isn't tasty. So he took a pinch of salt and sprinkled it into his guest's soup. So maybe the soup needs more salt. And the guest said to the Alter Rebbe, why are you adding salt? The problem is it's too salty. I don't understand how you're eating it. And the Alter Rebbe said, you know what, since I studied under the Maggid of Mezrich that first time, and it was for months, I had trained my mouth not to taste flavors. So I'm unaware of the saltiness or unsaltiness of the soup. And so, but that's a very, very high level. That's not for mere mortals. That's a story. Actually, I just want to add one thing. That's a story about a Rebbe. A Rebbe doesn't live in, his body is in this world, but his soul is not. His soul is always attached to the highest levels. So I just want to share that there's another story that I read here in this beautiful sefer called Stories, called Mesaprim Tanya, stories that go along with the themes of Tanya. That Reb Shmuel Munkes was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. And Reb Peretz Chaim tells the story how one time he came to visit this house of Reb Shmuel Munkes, and they went to bed at night. And Reb Shmuel asked his guest what time he wants to be awakened in the morning. And I'm sorry, the Peretz Chaim was the host and Reb Shmuel was the guest. And when he was going to bed, Reb Peretz asked Reb Shmuel, his guest, what time he wants to be awakened in the morning. And the answer was he wants him to wake, if Reb Peretz could wake him up at 3 o'clock in the morning so that he could prepare for davening properly. When Reb Shmuel woke up, he prepared for himself 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one for his host, Reb Peretz. When Reb Peretz woke up and he sees that Reb Shmuel has already finished his cup of coffee, and he sits down to drink the cup of coffee that Reb Shmuel had prepared for him. And he tasted it, and it was terribly bitter. And he did a little investigating, and he found out that Reb Shmuel Munkes, instead of putting coffee powder into the water, he had put tobacco powder into the water. I guess the 2 tins were next to each other. I don't know. So the Peretz asked Reb Shmuel, how did you finish your whole cup of coffee? It's not even coffee, it's tobacco. It's so bitter. How could you even swallow it? So Reb Shmuel says to him, believe me that it's already 13 years that I'm not tasting the flavor of the food that I'm eating. And that's not a Rebbe, that's a chassid. But again, Reb Shmuel is a huge, tremendous tzaddik, Reb Shmuel Munkes. So this is not the lifestyle for mere mortals. Mere mortals, we are going to taste the delicious flavors of the food if the food is delicious. And you don't have to fight with that. There's nothing bad about that. In fact, what we see from these examples that the Alter Rebbe brings here, that the Gemara is bringing here, is that in fact you can take advantage of the delightful flavors that exist in the foods that Hashem created. When the body is delighting, it revives the soul, and the soul operates better. But it's all about our intention. If the intention in eating the food is to serve Hashem, so let's say it's in the case of this fatty meats and spiced wines, really delightful things. If your intention is directly and exclusively that through the delight of this food, your mind will open, and your intention is only for the sake of opening your mind, you have no intention of bodily delights, none at all, and that's going to take some work, then the food ascends immediately and directly to the realm of holiness. On the other hand, as we'll see soon, if a person eats food because it's yummy, even if the person has a split intention, on the one hand, he is intending to serve Hashem, and that the delight from that food will open him up and revive his spirit and make him a more enthusiastic servant of Hashem. But at the same time, he's also a bit of a foodie. He likes the way it tastes. He's enjoying it, and he's looking forward to the flavor so that he could enjoy. Well, what's going to happen is that the life force of the food will descend into the world of unholiness, the world from which the desire to indulge oneself comes from. And only once the energy from that food has been used practically, actively in the service of Hashem, will that energy be rescued from the hands of the unholiness and elevated to Kedusha. That's the difference. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rabbi.
It's a little windy, but thanks for the question. All right, there's another example here from the Gemara. This one is from Eruvin. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel taught that if a person drank a quarter log of wine, I believe a log of wine is 12 ounces, a cup and a half. So what's a quarter of a cup and a half? You do the math, I don't know. A quarter of 12 is 4 ounces of wine. Quarter of 12 is 3, so 3 ounces of wine. Then he's no longer fit to make a halachic ruling because he's going to be confused and he's going to be inebriated. That's what Shmuel taught. Rav Nachman says that doesn't make sense. That can't be. That teaching is not perfect. Why? Because if I have not had a quarter of a lug of wine, my mind is not clear. My mind is agitated by all my concerns in the world, and I can't think calmly and clearly until I have said a l'chaim and had 3 ounces of wine. There's a debate about what a revius is, if it's 2.5 or 2.9 or 3.2, approximately 3 ounces of wine. So again, you see Rav Nachman is saying, I use the wine to open my mind up to learn Torah. Without the wine, I can't learn Torah properly. And this brings us to a beautiful teaching that's related to the parashas we've been reading recently. This is from Rabbi Bechaya. He explains on the story where Yitzchak Avinu says to his son Esau, I want to bless you, but before I bless you, I need you to go out and prepare for me a dinner, a delightful dinner, so that my soul should bless you. Strange. Why does the tzaddik Yitzchak need food and delightful food in order to be able to express a blessing to his son? Says the Rabbeinu Bechaya. It says, make for me a delicacy so that my soul will bless you. Ein kavonas Yitzchak b'she'elas hamata'amim b'tanug haguf v'chush hatam. Yitzchak's intention in asking for the delightful delicacy was not that he wanted to taste something yummy. His goal was not the physical experience, ella, rather, his intention was that his soul should be rejoicing and delighting. His soul. Because there's a parallel between the body's experience and the soul's state of mind, so to speak. When the body is feeling good, then the soul functions more effusively. And when the soul is rejoicing, that is when holy inspiration comes to rest upon a person. That is related to the teaching of the sages, that the Shekhinah only comes to rest on a person not when he is lazy and not when he is depressed, only when he is rejoicing. When the Navi Elisha could not produce a prophecy, he had musicians come and play for him to lift his spirit, because only when his spirit was rejoicing, that's when he was able to channel a prophecy from Hashem. That's when the presence of Hashem would rest upon him. That's why every time Yitzchak mentions that he wants to give a bracha, he always says, my soul will bless, my soul will bless. To emphasize that he's not after the physical, he's after something spiritual through the physical. His only intention in asking for a delicacy is that you can harness the delight that the body will feel from the delicacy in order to procure something that is a lofty spiritual thing. That was his exclusive intention. And that's the thing that the Alter Rebbe is describing here. When we're talking about a person whose exclusive intention, even though the body will in fact delight from that taste and that flavor and that experience, nevertheless, it's about your intention. It's about your intention. I didn't put the text of the quote here, but there is a reference in the book Hasidus Mevu'eres on Tanya to a teaching from Tam HaMitzvahs by Rabbi Chaim Vital, who says that when it's in the moment of intimacy between a husband and wife, that's another wonderful example of how you could be doing something that necessarily causes delight to the person physically. But it's all about your intention. If the intention is to delight in the physical pleasure, then the energy from that act is going to go down into klipa. It's going to go down into the hands of unholiness until the person will do some activity to elevate it and rescue it from there. We're going to learn this. Actually. The Alter Rebbe references it at the end of what we're going to learn today, Mitzvah Shem. On the other hand, if the intention during the time of intimacy is purely and exclusively to fulfill the command of Hashem, then even though the body is inescapably delighting in the experience, there is no cause for the life of that activity, for the life force, the energy that's invested in that activity, to go down into the realm of unholiness. It will go directly to the Tzad HaKedusha, to the camp of purity and holiness, and be elevated to Hashem. Now, I think we've covered all the... that's the first example. The Alter Rebbe gives us first, in his brief wording, these examples. Here, when you're eating fat beef and spiced wines, in order to expand your mind to Hashem and to His Torah. That's your exclusive intention. Another example is or when the actual eating itself is the fulfillment of a mitzvah, as we see from Rambam in the laws of Shabbos. How do you fulfill the mitzvah of delighting on Shabbos? There's a mitzvah to delight on Shabbos. How do you fulfill that mitzvah? What does it mean to delight on Shabbos? That's what the Chachamim touch. The sage explained that that's by preparing extra rich foods and extra fragrant wines for Shabbos. That's how you honor Shabbos. And if you haven't done that, you have not fulfilled the mitzvah. Same thing on Yom Tov. We're supposed to cause extra rejoicing on Yom Tov. How do we cause extra rejoicing? Well, it says Ketzad. How do you do it? Haktanim, for children. Noisin lahem kiloyos vegoizim umigdonis. You give them candy, things that they will be happy with. Vehanashim, and for women, a man's obligation is to cause his wife to rejoice on the Yom Tov. He has to buy nice outfits and nice jewelry for whatever, according to his means. He's not supposed to break the bank, but he certainly should give her a nice gift in honor of Yom Tov to lift her spirits. What should the men do for themselves to lift the spirit of Yom Tov, to have extra rejoicing on Yom Tov? Should eat beef and drink wine, because there is no rejoicing without beef and there's no rejoicing without wine. Footnote, the commentaries say, or whatever. And they don't say that disparagingly, they say that very specifically. A person has to spend extra funds in honor of Yom Tov to bring into his house things that cause him or things that cause her extra joy in order to bring about extra delight on Yom Tov. That's the fulfillment of the mitzvah. So why would a person be drinking extra rich foods and extra fragrant wines on Shabbos and Yom Tov? Because that itself is the fulfillment of the mitzvah. In these two cases, of these two examples, Azai, under those conditions, previously those kosher foods were receiving their life from klipas noiga, the soft klipa, the soft impurity, the soft unholiness. But now what you have done is you have transformed the very core, the very life of that object. The oila la Hashem ke oila, and then the beef can arise and ascend to holiness unto Hashem. The meat like a burnt offering on the Mizbeach, just as the burnt offering on the altar in the Holy Temple was in the fire, it would rise up to Hashem completely. So too the beef that you eat in the fulfillment of a mitzvah, or the beef that you eat in order to open your mind and heart to Hashem, if that's your exclusive intention, that beef will also rise up to Hashem like a burnt offering. And the same is with the wine, which is also, wine is often offered on the altar in the Holy Temple, on the Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash as a korban. And when we use permitted objects for the sake of Hashem exclusively, then those objects are elevated and they become completely subsumed in the world of holiness. So far, we have discussed physical delight. What about emotional delight? There are devices that we can use for emotional delight. The example we saw in the Gemara is music. What if you use music, kosher music, obviously, to help to delight, to cause joy, to lift your spirits? What's the science behind that kind of activity? Or as the Alter Rebbe says, "V'chein ha'omer milsa d'bdichusa, lepakeach daitoi u'lesameach libei la'Hashem u'leterasei v'avidasei, shetzirichim lihiyos b'simcha." We know the principle that the service of Hashem must be done joyously. Therefore, says the Alter Rebbe, what about a person who tells jokes in order to either open his mind, as the Alter Rebbe brings next paragraph, Rava would always open his lectures with some kind of humorous remark, and then the students would become cheerful and they would be more receptive to learn and understand what he was saying. There is a lecturer online on YouTube, a Jewish lecturer from one of the Jewish universities in New York, that is very particular to start all his lectures with a joke. And by his own confession, he only has like 12 jokes. So he cycles through the jokes, but he's very particular. You got to start a lecture with a joke. Like the joking, when its exclusive intention is to relax the person, open up their mind, make them receptive to learning, or even to cause them to become happier and be able to serve Hashem with joy. If that's the exclusive intention, then the life force of that activity that originally came from klipa is refined and purified and automatically ascends to the realm of holiness without passing go and without collecting $200. However, now we'll learn about the opposite. On the other hand, a person who is a glutton for meat, for beef, and he is a person who loves to drink wine, and his intention in that activity is to satisfy his desire, the desire of his body and of his animalistic soul. Remember in chapter 1, we learned that the soul is built of the 4 elements. The animalistic soul is built of the 4 elements. And each of the 4 elements produces a nasty side effect. The nasty side effect of the element of water is unquenchable desire for yummy things. Well, the animalistic soul has such a desire for rich meat and fragrant wine. And if a person drinks fragrant wine and eats fatty meats in order to fulfill his desire, then through that action, the life force of the meat and the life force of this kosher wine that is inside of the person now, because when you consume the meat, you consume also the life force that is within the meat, and that life force takes, it enters the body, and now it's housed in your body. That life force will descend together with the person into unholiness. As we said in chapter 6, when a person is involved in an action that is not for the sake of Hashem, the whole person is now a servant to unholiness. The whole body of the person, the whole conscious mind of the person is now a chariot for the dictates of unholiness. And at that time, the life force that you received from the kosher foods you ate and the kosher drinks you drank, they come along with you into the realm of unholiness. And they too are, at least for the time being, a chariot or a slave to unholiness, to impurity. As the glutton's body becomes a vehicle for the klipa, so does the life force that came from that beautiful kosher meat and that wonderful kosher wine, which is very sad, because previously they were parav. Previously they were neither on the team of unholiness or on the team of holiness. And now, because the person interacted with that meat and that wine inappropriately, that he didn't sanctify himself, he didn't conduct himself in a sanctified manner with permitted things, which is a commandment in the Torah, as we'll see later in Tanya, then he's caused the fall of those wonderful creations of Hashem, the meat that he ate and the drink that and the wine that he drank. But it's important to note this very, very crucial bit of information. Says the Alter Rebbe, that it is lefi shah. It's only temporary. It's a temporary fall. Why? Ad asher yashuv ha'adam, because this food is by its very nature kosher, permitted, and the act that the person did is not a sinful act. It does not transform the meat and the wine into something forbidden, into something permanently impure. It's a temporary fail until the person will right himself, till the person will correct his ways. When the person returns to the service of Hashem, and again his body or her body becomes a chariot for the will of Hashem and the command of Hashem, then the life force of the food that's inside of him will also become a chariot for the will of Hashem and be elevated to the realm of holiness. In the Alter Rebbe's words. I'm sorry, I skipped something. That's only for a certain amount of time. Until the person will return to serving Hashem and to studying his Torah. The reason is, since this meat is innately kosher and the wine is essentially kosher, therefore, when the person who is also essentially kosher returns to serve Hashem, any other kosher life force that's inside of him will return right along with him. This is actually indicated in the very language that the sages use to describe things that we are allowed to do and things that we are not allowed to do. In telling us that we are allowed to do something, that an activity or a food or an object is permitted, or that a activity or a food or an object is forbidden, the sages choose the term heter or mutar as opposed to asur. Heter and mutar, actually, if you translate them literally, it means unbound or released, as in something was tied up together, something was bound with chains and ropes. But this thing is unbound, not tied together with chains and ropes. What's the meaning of that? Some objects in the world are chained with, they are bound with chains and ropes to the forces of unholiness, and no matter what the Jew will do with those objects, he or she will not be able to save them, to rescue them and elevate them to holiness. It doesn't matter what you try. Only those things that are not essentially bound with chains and ropes to the forces of unholiness, only those things are permitted, mutar, heter, for a Jew to interact with. Because when you encounter those things, you have the ability to elevate them to holiness and make them a home for Hashem, which is the purpose for our existence. On the other hand, something that is completely bound, permanently chained to the forces of unholiness, and a Jew has no possibility of elevating them to holiness or transforming them into a home for Hashem, not only will he not be able to elevate that object will drag him down, leaving a permanent stain on him, on her, and that cannot be reverted. That cannot be fixed. Let's just fill out the example. If a person, God forbid, and we'll do this, God willing, next week as well. If a person eats a non-kosher meal, by the letter of the law, without a very robust and brilliant tshuva, that food will always remain a dead weight in the person's spiritual tummy. it takes an exceptionally brilliant tshuva to transform the food that a person ate that was literally forbidden by the Torah, bound with chains and ropes to unholiness. It would take a brilliant tshuva to release that energy, that impurity from its bondage and its connection with unholiness. But of course, that's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about permissible things. We're talking about kosher food. The only problem in this whole interaction was that the person didn't even use it sinfully. He only used it selfishly instead of selflessly. He used that permitted object in a permitted way, but he did it for himself as opposed to doing it for Hashem. What happened then? The energy from that food descends temporarily into the realm of unholiness until he returns to the service of Hashem, and then the food comes with him. But it's not perfect because there is a remnant, there is a stain that's left on the body since the body was allowed its, like a rider of a horse. You give the horse its head and the horse runs off and does whatever it wants. In that case, the body was allowed to express its own greediness, its own selfishness, its own indulgence, and that leaves a permanent mark of evil on the body. It causes, like it says in Kabbalah, in the Zohar, it causes a damaging spirit and a damaging, a dirty garment, so to speak, to become permanently attached to the body, and that's only cured unless a person will do conscious tshuva. That is only rectified by a certain type of afterlife cleansing called chibut hakever, where the body is tossed around inside the grave. We'll explain more about chibut hakever later on. One more point to just round off this picture. And that is, as we mentioned earlier, v'chein, you realize that the Alter Rebbe chose so far 3 examples of things that is very, very hard to do purely for the sake of Hashem. But in each case, the Alter Rebbe says that it's possible, it can be done. The first example was delicious meat. How hard it would be to eat a delicious steak purely for the sake of Hashem. Very hard. But the Alter Rebbe says you can do it. It's a matter of your intention. It'll take some practice, but you practice, stay focused, remember what your mission is. You can do it. Same thing with drinking whatever your favorite drinks are. It's so hard to delight the body, to do something that delights the body without intending to delight the body at all. It's hard, but you can do it, says the Alter Rebbe. Joking, another example that the Alter Rebbe brings, is just, it's so delicate, it's so dangerous spiritually. There's a risk in joking because joking could so easily lead to frivolity, which is forbidden. We're not allowed to mess around. We are allowed to carefully and strategically joke and sing and dance in order to serve Hashem properly. We are not allowed to get frivolous. My father shares the story often when he and his friends were sitting in 770 in the yeshiva, and one of the Rosh Yeshiva, I will tell you that the name was Bukit, I'm not 100% sure about that, came over, no, not Bukit, Mentlik. I'll check, we'll confirm the name. Rabbi Mentlik came over and quoted to them a verse that says, the kids were then, when Mashiach comes, our mouths will be filled with laughter. In the time of Golus, you're allowed to joke, you're allowed to rejoice, but too much, that's already frivolity. It's inappropriate. Good. Those are the 3 examples the Alter Rebbe gave. And now the Alter Rebbe brings perhaps the very, very hardest of them all. And that is, as we said before, the act of intimacy, which is a tremendous pleasure for the body. And the Alter Rebbe is saying, and yet you can do it purely for the sake of Hashem. Purely for the sake of Hashem. The question again is, the human beings, he knows that it's going to be delightful. He's eating meat, he's drinking wine, he's being intimate, he's telling jokes. There's going to be delight. And in your life, you need to have pleasure. You cannot live a life without pleasure. The question is, are we delighting from the physical pleasure, or are we delighting from the spiritual pleasure of fulfilling the commandment of Hashem? That's the training that we need to put ourselves through. That when we are engaged in something delightful, we have to focus on the fact that the truest delight in that experience is the delight of fulfilling Hashem's command. Let's read. The same is true with regards to the drops of seed that come from the body as a result of the acts of intimacy, if it was expressed with even a mixed intention, somewhat to fulfill the mitzvah and somewhat to fulfill the desires of the body, the energy of that activity and the energy of those seeds are going to fall down into the realm of unholiness. He didn't do anything sinful. There was no sin. The lady was pure. The act is permitted, encouraged. It's a mitzvah, but that was not his intention. If the intention was not for the sake of the mitzvah, if the intention was even mixed, a little bit for the mitzvah and a little bit for me, the energy from that activity, until he will return to the service of Hashem, will fall down into the grips of unholiness. At a Farbrengen, I'm celebrating the 19th of Kislev, which is coming right up on not this coming Tuesday, but the following Tuesday. And to honor and celebrate that date, we have none other than the great and famous Rabbi Yossi Goldman from South Africa. He's coming to address our community, and Emetz Hashem, his Rebbitzin as well. Mrs. Rachel Goldman, I think her name is, will address our community here at Chabad House. So, bear that in mind. More information will be forthcoming. At a celebration of Yotes Kislev by the Rebbe Rashab, the 5th Rebbe of Lubavitch, many mature Hasidim were there. Mature meaning they have really worked on themselves and developed themselves into proper servants of Hashem. They came to delight in the Farbrengen. They were delighting in the Torah that was being shared. They were delighting in the presence of the tzaddik that was there. Now, on the table, there was also a plate of, what do they call it? Buckwheat, kasha. Buckwheat groats, as is the Hasidic custom to eat that on Yotes Kislev. And some of them were eating it with great pleasure. And the Rebbe said to them, you forgot that you are eating physical food. You're eating buckwheat. When the Rebbe tells the story, when our Rebbe tells the story, he emphasizes this. Spiritual richness was available at that Farbrengen. That's the richness. That is what the Hasidim came to pursue. They came to experience a spiritual delight for their godly souls. It also brought along with it a aroused animal soul that causes the animal soul to pursue its delights. And instead of remaining focused on the spiritual, the Hasidim, the Rebbe Rashab was telling those gathered at that Farbrengen, you have allowed yourselves to wander from the world of spiritual delight unknowingly or unconsciously into the world of physical delights, unlike what we're saying here in this chapter of Tanya. It's all about what is your intention. Are we pursuing the delight of holiness through the performance of a mitzvah, even when it causes delight for the body? Or are we pursuing a connection to Hashem? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? Okay. Thanks for joining. Please feel free to ask any questions and share all your comments.